right, welcome back, everybody. My name is Daniel Sanderson, and I'm with my good friend
Ty Keynes, and welcome back to Talk Through the Loop. And today we have a special guest, Regan Boychuk, co-founder and researcher with the Plato Federation. And he has an interesting theory about how the U.S. has hijacked the Alberta oil industry. Regan, how are you doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
All right. Here's the thing. Tell me about this hijacking of the Alberta oil industry.
Well, I've been researching the Alberta oil and gas industry for 15 years, and the last 5 years has been focused around cleanup and trying to get the industry to clean up after itself. And only very recently did I come to appreciate how close Canada came to actually achieving that a generation ago at the end of the Cold War. I had no idea how very seriously Canada tried to stand up to the oil and gas industry and to uphold the polluter pay principle and to make them clean up after themselves. Not only the provincial cabinet backed environmental protection orders against a bankrupt company, but the regulators stepped up and said, you're not going to be able to give your stuff away to whoever you want anymore. You're not going to be able to let it rust forever. And we're going to change the laws. So if the new guy can't clean up, we're coming back at you. And then the Chief Justice of Alberta ruled in the Northern Badger case in June 1991 saying polluter must pay. Comes even before the banks. If the regulator tells you to clean up, you have to. And then the cherry on top, in November 1991, the Canadian Bankers Association came out with a public report saying they supported polluter pay, that they wouldn't lend money to polluters unless they were sure they didn't have a mess or wouldn't make a mess, and they were going to crack down on industry. I had no idea how concerted this effort was across the spectrum in Canada, but I do know that nothing came of it, that 30 years later, we still have 300,000 wells that need to be cleaned up. There's no funding for it. We haven't been making them clean up. And so I've spent all these years digging into this, trying to make sense of it and find out what happened. And I finally have figured out how we could have tried so hard and yet failed. And it comes down to a secret meeting that was held with regulators here in Alberta and the American industry through their lobbyists on January 17th, 1991.
Wow. So 300,000 wells, did you say?
That's how many there are today. There were only about 50,000 back then in 1991. We've drilled 250,000 since.
Are these active wells or wells that are no longer producing?
It's a mixture. And
Okay.
so that's all of the wells that are yet to be cleaned up. Some have been plugged and the site needs to be cleaned up. Most of them are sitting idle, just rusting. Some produced a little bit, and even a tiny amount produced still a significant amount. And so 250,000 of those 300,000, 5 out of 6 are already depleted or inactive. There's either nothing left in them or they're just already rotting. And so we've accumulated an enormous amount just sitting rusting out there.
Right. And I think what I've heard is you're correct, the polluter pays, but if these small or medium-sized oil extraction companies go out of business, that kind of leaves the buck on the general public for cleanup, as I understand.
That is the dilemma. Alberta has very wonderful energy law. There's a solution to every one of these problems. There's legal obligations forcing industry to clean up all of this stuff. But without a regulator to enforce it, to make them do that, the law is just words on paper. And the Chief Justice of Alberta in the Northern Badger case in 1991 said, cleanup comes first. That was 30 years ago. The regulator has yet to invoke that court case. They've yet to use the power that the court said you had 30 years ago. You can make anyone clean up before the banks get paid, before they sell it off to the next guy. You can step in and take all the money. It's 30 years later. The regulator still hasn't used it. So we have wonderful law, and everyone pays lip service to polluter pay up and down the spectrum, even in industry. But unless there's a regulator that's going to make someone do something, they're going to drain the holes till there's nothing left, and they're going to walk away. And since 1991, that's been the secret but official policy. In January 17th, 1991, they made a no-look-back deal. Alberta regulators promised you can sell or give away your wells, and we promise to never look backwards. And so what happened in 1991 is, rather than more wells being cleaned up because the court said you had to, and we were all trying to make them, not only did no wells get cleaned up in 1991 or 1992, the economic conditions of no lookbacks, of a free-for-all, of the law doesn't apply, created a criminogenic environment where not only were wells not cleaned up, they came back from the dead. Wells that had already been idled and depleted were turned back on, because now you could still play financial games with them, and you didn't have to worry about ever being held accountable. And so it's quite an amazing thing. I was surprised how hard even the Conservative government of Alberta tried to make the polluter pay, but the Americans said, no, you may not. And that was the same day that the Gulf War was launched. It was the first day that the US bombs fell on Baghdad. Everything was hopey and changey up to that point. The Cold War had ended. Much of the developed world was trying to assert its independence from the US. We thought we could spend money on things other than the military. And the environment was one of the ways Western governments asserted their independence from the US. And that's how Canada tried to break off a piece and tried to make industry clean up. There was tens of billions of dollars of cleanup back in 1991, but they said no. And what it's meant since is that everyone in industry knows perfectly well they won't have to clean up. And so what they've done since 1991, when we only had 50,000 wells, they drilled 250,000 more, and they haven't set aside any money, and they haven't cleaned up squat. And in the meantime, we've added the oil sands to the mix, because right after the coup in 1991 and 1992, the first thing they did was get on board to develop the oil sands. The Americans had opposed the development ever since Lougheed came into office. But after the coup, when you weren't going to have to worry about cleaning up the oil sands, it became a pretty attractive investment. And they set about developing SAGD, the steam-assisted development that took off in the 90s. And in 1997, we adopted a royalty regime for the oil sands. It was written by 6 oil sands executives. And the premier, that the same folks who plotted this coup in Alberta that promised no lookbacks, they were after the oil sands, and this royalty regime gave it away. We gave it away for 1 penny on the dollar. If you give us 1 penny for every dollar of bitumen, that's the bargain. And I'm just a roofer. I'm not an economist, but I am an expert on royalties and the economics of oil and gas in Alberta. And I served on the royalty review panel for the oil sands, and I understand the economics pretty well.
Daniel?
I have
Daniel?
a question. Yeah.
Okay, good. Because I just want the audience to know Daniel is a former resident of Alberta. So I am quite keen to hear his comments on this.
Well, this is actually a really fascinating story, and I was really impressed with how you explained that history. It actually has the potential, I think, for a good book, right? Like there's probably some serious research that you've done behind that, and I congratulate you for that and pulling all that together, right? I mean, that's a piece of history there for you. A little bit of a simpler question that I have: Alberta is kind of like the little Texas, right? I mean, from a oil and gas standpoint, right? It's like Texas, but not like Texas, right? I mean, because it's Canada and it's not like the United States. But my question is, these companies, these oil companies, I would assume that they had oil rigs throughout the United States too. Do you know how our non-existent cleanup compared to regulations in their own country? Like, did they clean things up, 25% better in America, or were they forced by any laws or state regulations? Did they have a better standard in the United States at that point? Do you know?
No, it was it was slightly better. The Alberta regulator in 1938 was set up by the Americans. Manning invited Americans in to organize our first oil and gas regulator. 5 of the first 8 heads of our regulator were Americans. All of their correspondence has been lost. We don't know what they were up to during those first 20 years. So the Alberta regulatory system was modeled on the Americans, but it was an improvement because we were a blank slate. And so it's even more permissive. It was given dictatorial powers in 1938. It's above all the courts. Nothing can be appealed. You can't stop it. You can't get in an injunction. Nobody who works there is liable for anything. Those are the conscious, explicit powers we gave to this regulator, and those extend to cleanup. And so if Albertans were running the regulator, they had extensive powers to force cleanup. And the same is true in the States. I've talked to many of the regulators there. They have the necessary powers to do all sorts of things, but they don't. And it's a very curious coincidence that in every state and province in North America, they have separate independent regulators with long histories, but they all have very curious shortcomings. They don't keep track of spills. They don't keep proper records. They don't keep track of who used to own that well. Those are very, very strange things for somebody who's managing these trillions of dollars of resources and these long-term liabilities. But just by accident, all of them, they don't keep track of those things. And they don't stop transfers when the depleted wells to bankrupt companies. That's against the law. And they have the power to stop that, but they don't. And you can't make them either. That's what we're doing with the Polluter Pay Federation here in Alberta. Shell was selling a bunch of depleted sour licenses to a new startup who has dreams of building a pipeline to the east coast of Canada and an LNG plant to ship natural gas to Germany. It's a pipe dream. And so we tried to intervene at the regulator to have a hearing to stop that license transfer. We want to argue before a quasi-judicial hearing the economics of this transfer. Show me where the profit is in these remaining wells. But the regulator dodged for a couple of years and has now canceled it. They don't want to have that hearing. But those regulators have very big shortcomings, which make our lovely laws rather worthless. But it's a rather curious position where we have rogue regulators. We can't do all sorts of things. They're not paying farmers. They're not paying their taxes here in Alberta. They have the lowest royalty rates in the world. But we can't make them do anything. And even the provincial cabinet doesn't step in, doesn't require them. We have $250 billion by the regulator's own internal estimate of unfunded cleanup between the oil sands and the regulated industry. But nobody's doing anything about it. There's no money set aside. It's curious.
Yeah, well, it makes me think about creating laws just to, it would seem like a win if a law was created like that for people who cared about the environment, like on the agenda. If it was put in law and it was the only remaining thing was enforcement, I mean, say, hey, that's pretty good. We've got, and what I'm hearing you say is that we have a great law in place. We just choose to not use it, which is really bizarre.
We achieved more in Alberta 30 years ago. That effort, the laws that we had and the efforts we make, that's more than any jurisdiction anywhere in the world has ever accomplished. Nobody's ever cleaned up anything. And to the extent you've been able to get a regulator to do something, it's here and there, it's marginal. But what Alberta accomplished, putting polluter pay into law. And so the other part of that secret no look back deal when the Gulf War started was they said, we won't look back, but the industry promises to fund all resulting orphans. And so that was the explicit deal, that you guys, do your thing, run everything into the ground. But at the end of the day, the rest of industry will chip in and clean up the orphan wells. That was the bargain. That's codified in law here in Alberta. Section 11 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act codifies that all orphans will be immediately funded by all remaining industry. So all the oil sands companies with all that production, they've promised to fund the cleanup of all the wells that come at the end. They don't. We still let them set that tally. But accomplishing that, codifying that, making it an industry expense. Taxpayers pay for most orphans, most places. But in Alberta, industry has to. That's a major accomplishment. No one has tried as hard as Alberta. We are the canary in the coal mine. That was the first time somebody tried to make the oil and gas industry clean up. There's a very good reason we don't know, though. So there was Alberta was and Canada was trying very hard to set up polluter pay. When the regulators put out a public report and said, these are the rules, these are the laws we're going to change, so you can't keep doing this. Industry panicked. Ralph Klein was the environment minister at the time. He came back from Christmas holidays after that report to say, I'm rewriting all the environmental law in Alberta. It's a 2-year project. I'm going to take all 16 environmental laws. And Ralph Klein, of all people, he's going to rewrite all of our environmental laws for us. And he was working on it. Then they lost the court case. So he took his draft legislation out and he had to rejig it to fix things up so things wouldn't ever get back to the courts. And he did that with the Environmental Appeal Board. But the real panic for the American owners of most of the industry was November 1991 when the bankers backed polluter pay. I mean, the game is over. If there isn't local banks to lend to oil companies, there's not going to be any money to steal. And so the same officials that had that no look back meeting on January 17th, they set up a subcommittee in November 1991, as soon as the bankers report came out, because this was a real crisis. If the bankers weren't on board, everything was going to fall apart. So they set up a well-licensed criteria subcommittee, it was called. And the first thing they did was sit down with the Canadian Bankers Association and straighten them out and obviously tell them that you don't have to worry about all this cleanup stuff. It's not going to happen. But the reason I was confused for so long and everyone else was that the Northern Badger case seemed like good law is because there was a giant newspaper series in the Edmonton Journal, the capital of the province, the major daily newspaper of record, had a huge series in July 1992 about the Northern Badger case and how the industry was cleaning everything up. It is the most amazing journalism on this topic before or since. There's nothing that compares to it. They sent 2 reporters out in the field for 2 months. And everybody was talking, every oil executive, every rig hand, telling horror stories about the old days and how bad it was. But everything has changed, they told us. It's a bright new world. Everything is being cleaned up. Everything. 2 years ago, I got the statistics from back in those days. How many wells were drilled, reactivated, idled, plugged, reclaimed, all of the stats. The regulator would never share them with me, but the New York Times got them for me. And what the actual statistics from those years show is that nothing was cleaned up. And so that newspaper series in the Edmonton Journal was fake. It was to cover the tracks of the coup. They had 3-4 stories every day for an entire week about this huge issue because it was all fixed. They'd already solved it all and everybody was cleaning up. Turns out that it never happened. And so at the same time, what we know now is the lobby in Canada, CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. It was created at this time. There was a few different lobbies. They were all controlled by the Americans, but kind of coalesced into CAP right at that time. And the first thing CAP did was publish a big cleanup manual, a big complex manual about how everyone could clean up under these new rules. Well, it was obviously fake because nobody cleaned anything up. But then CAP also held a cleanup conference. And it was so popular, it was oversubscribed. More people, they $100 a ticket, and hundreds of people showed up. And they held that cleanup conference, which was obviously fake because nobody cleaned anything up. There was a secret no look back deal. Everybody knew it. And so this cleanup conference was also fake. But it was in Calgary the week before the leadership convention, where the governing party of Alberta was going to be picking its new leader. And a couple months after that secret no look back deal in January 1992, 1991. In April 1991, two things happened. Regulator gave a speech at a drilling conference in Calgary to let everybody know there's no look back deal. It's the way it's going to go. We're not going to look back. You're going to do your thing. So everybody in the industry knows. And another thing happened in April 1991. The Conservative Party of Alberta changed its constitution to adopt a new American-style open primary for its leadership convention coming up the following November. And the thing about these open primaries is they favor mavericks, outsiders who can flood the zone and take over from the establishment. Someone like Ralph Klein, who had no support in cabinet, very few endorsements, but you're allowed to buy a $5 membership for the party at the voting booth door. And so 120,000 people joined the Conservative Party to vote in the convention the week after the fake cleanup convention in Calgary. And then on December 5th, there was the second round runoff, and Ralph Klein won in the landslide. 30,000 new members bought memberships and voted for Ralph Klein. We had a new premier. And so July 1992 was the fake newspaper series. There was lots of stories in the press throughout the fall, same kind of flavor. It was doomy and gloomy. The January 1991 court case, everyone thought everyone was cleaning up. The drilling prospects were low. Everything was down, depressed, until after Ralph Klein. January 1993, Klein's the new premier. It's bright new days out of nowhere. There's all sorts of money. Drilling boom. The banks were back on board. And there was a mini industry boom sail to the general election in June 1993, 6 months after he came in on a drilling boom, easily won the election. And they set about getting their hands on our oil sands after that. But that is how we lost control of an industry we tried to hold accountable. And most of what's happened, there's been some internal efforts at the regulator to try again, but they've been pretty easily rebuffed. And there hasn't been any really serious efforts towards the cleanup since. It's been mostly lip service. And despite all of our efforts here in Alberta, we can't get the regulator to do anything on cleanup. We can't get the government to force the regulator to do anything on cleanup, and increasingly difficult getting the media to even pay attention to this issue that hasn't gone anywhere, hasn't shrunk, but continues to grow every day while money is drained out.
So to fast forward here, what is going to be the process to clean up this gigantic mess in Alberta? Is it simply a regulator with teeth? Is it more media attention? What's your thoughts on actually moving forward and cleaning up these wells?
The prospects are actually incredibly bright if Alberta is independent. I mean, none of this is possible without a democratic oil and gas regulator. If we don't have control of the regulator, it's hopeless. But if we do, I think Alberta is actually probably unique in that it's not too late here. You pick any other jurisdiction, Texas, Colorado, other states, lots of mess. US has millions of wells. There's not a lot of money left in those holes. Up here in Alberta, we have the oil sands. It's another scandal, at least this big, how much we give away, but it's already built. It produces $150 billion of bitumen every year, and that's ours. And so the only way to clean up is with the future profit that still remains in the ground. Everything that's come up to today is gone. We've already lost it. They stole it. We're not going to get their vacation homes. We're not going to get their bonuses back. But there is still enough future profit left in the ground. It's going to come up even within a carbon budget. That in Alberta, there's still more than enough money, future profit, to pay for the cleanup and to make the transition. That resource rent, the unearned excess profit, after your costs are covered and you get a 10% return on all your investments, all that extra money is resource rent. And that belongs to the public. These are publicly owned resources. The resource rent 100% belongs to the citizens. Even Ralph Klein's energy department recognized that. And so in part of my investigation to figure out how much life is left in the wells, before it's too late for them to fund their cleanup, it also tells us how much money is left in each hole. And with that, we could still collect the remaining profit from industry. taking nothing from no one. We wouldn't have to tax anyone. We wouldn't have to go after these wrongdoers. We wouldn't have to try to get the money back. We say, you got us. Good one. You can keep all the money. But from now on, all the profit that's still going to come out of the ground, it's going to come under democratic control, and we're going to use that to clean up this mess you've created and to make the transition within the carbon budget.
Daniel, what do you think?
Okay, you guys just elected Pierre as the new Conservative Party leader, right? I mean, we all did, I guess, right? As Canadians, how do you think he's going to handle something like this? I'd like to get your opinion on it. Like, would he? Because to me, what you're explaining actually is very compelling for Albertans. Right?
I agree. And I think the Conservative Party, at certain points in its life, would have been all over this. I grew up in Alberta hating the Conservatives, thinking they were the crooks that have given all this away. It turns out, I mean, they were the local capitalists, but they did try to stand up to big oil. And they did put in some good laws, and they did put in some good rules. And when they were in charge of their own house, we did things better. Because the question I keep asking myself over and over is, who would do this to themselves? Who would give away $1 trillion of oil in the oil sands for a penny on the dollar? Who would let industry? The answer is no one. It's because we're not doing this to ourselves. And so the Conservative Party of the olden days, Lougheed stood up to big oil. He quadrupled royalties. Getty stood up to big oil. He tried to make the polluter pay. Even Stelmach in 2007, he tried to stand up and raise royalties. The NDP was elected in 2015. They never stood up, despite all of our. They were aware. Their policy is now no different than the UCP here in Alberta. We don't have an opposition, and the federal option, conservatively, could have been some help at one point. Pierre was in my French class at university when he was working with at the University of Calgary, when he was working for Stockwell Day. I didn't really know him well. He might have been in Model United Nations with me for a moment or two, but he's not going to stand up to industry. He's not going to defend Alberta, and unfortunately, if that's the way things are going, we wouldn't see any federal help here in Alberta from that direction for sure, I don't think.
Well, there you have it. Pipelines and Pipe Dreams by Regan Boychuk. We're about out of time. I think we're going to have you back because there's so much more I want to unpack about the coup and how Alberta had so many existential things controlling its oil industry. I think there's so much more. We're going to have you back, but we're running out of time. So I thank you for being with us. I'm Ty Keynes.
And I'm Daniel Sanders.